I now call on Deputy Colm Keaveney to speak. You have
Look,
10 minutes.
the government parties had an opportunity to address the serious issue of family home repossession when they introduced the Land and Conveyancing Bill in the spring of 2013. They had been warned by the opposition deputies on this side of the House about what was to be eventually enacted, and it was then described as a missed opportunity to rebalance debt and the resolution process and to provide for an equality of arms between debtor and creditor. My colleague, Deputy Billy Kelleher, specifically predicted that when families in arrears with their mortgages found their homes appreciating in value to the point that they were out of negative equity, that they would then face the full onslaught of the banks seeking to repossess their homes. He quoted, and I will borrow that quote, "My concern is that the banks will cherry-pick those houses that were in some equity or value, even though there are massive mortgages and significant arrears. They are the properties of whose values have halved, whose owners are in difficult circumstances, incapable of making any meaningful repayment. The Minister knows all well that the banking institutions in the state who were previously flogging mortgages, selling credit cards, personal loans, holidays, car loans, that they're all members of a nutting squad, bringing people to talk to the banks. The bottom line is that they want to get their pound of flesh and that we would have an oversight provided by the government in this area." He went on to quote that with the best will in the world, this is flawed legislation from start to finish. Whatever happens between now and the passing of the bill, the Minister would have to at least listen to our suggestions in the opposition, and that Minister Shatter at the time, visit Meath East during the by-election and no doubt met with some staggering numbers of people who were shattered and who had not seen any light at the end of the tunnel. Cathaoirleach, Deputy Kelleher went on to quote that people in those circumstances had almost half written off their own hopes of aspiration, but their main concern at the time was no longer in their hope, but the hope of their children. Minister, this is devastating on the lives of people. And he went on to quote that the hopes and aspirations are now dependent on the banks deciding what was reasonable for an offer to a borrower. Cathaoirleach, Deputy Kelleher placed his finger on the central problem of debt resolution in that debate. And it was the failure of the government to remove the veto on the power of the banks over the process of debt resolution. By doing so, then essentially the government left the banks, the very people who had lent recklessly to the customer in the first place, and holding the whip's hand over the families who were in a distressed situation. And with much else, this government, it didn't see families as individuals who were struggling or suffering. It didn't see that they could possibly become homeless, that elderly living with any dignity in their community, who possibly could be lying in an A&E tonight, that they had rights, and that they were all people in society who were going through difficult circumstances, but they were going to have their homes repossessed. And the government parties could only see that the pounds, the shillings and the pence, the cost to individuals was lost in that legislation. And in response to warnings from the opposition benches, the families who would face repossession, the Minister then said at the time, I quote, "We cannot sustain an ongoing lack of certainty with regard to the legal position of mortgages. We cannot sustain a situation, on one hand, where banks are expected to lend by way of mortgage, on the other hand, that there's a lack of certainty around the legal exercising rights when it comes to the default of a borrower." The then Ministers, I quote, went on to say that it's simply unsustainable that a legal position could be maintained this way. And I've stated on a number of occasions that the repossession of a family home is intended to be the last resort. Minister, there's dry legalese. That's what it was. And it's stripped of any bare sense of social good or the necessity to have an equality and an equity, to have a right to have a house in this country. And Deputy Shatter went on to specifically deny that there would be any opening of a floodgate with respect to the family home repossessions in this country. And he wasn't alone, because in the contributions made to the bill on the 1st of May in 2013, Deputy Tuffy responded to claims of widespread repossession by stating, I quote, "There has been considerable scaremongering about this bill, some of which is opportunist, populist and disingenuous. She went on to quote that all of the opposition speakers that I've heard in the past 35 minutes are guilty of scaremongering. Deputy Michael McNamara stated, I quote, "I do not accept that there's a rush on behalf of the banks to repossess." But yet we are standing here today debating the reality of a situation where more than 15% of the mortgages for family homes are now in this country in arrears. That's 117,000 dwelling houses. Accounts that almost to 60,000 of those are in arrears for more than 1 year. Since, Minister, this government came into office, the numbers in arrears has increased by far more than 180 days in arrears and has doubled to the extent of 74,000 who have arrears that are less than 4 years. Minister, the mortgage arrears crisis is now ingrained in our economy. Over 30% of accounts in arrears are now 720 days in arrears. And at last count, there were 1,400 residential properties where repossessions by banks well more than double what was the situation in December 2010. Minister, the Sunday Independent recently described how repossessions through the circuit courts are now being achieved at an unstoppable momentum. An unstoppable momentum as the banks move to seize and move to have their hands on the positive equity of those properties. More worryingly, Minister, the repossession numbers we are seeing in the courts, it is the tip of the iceberg. And recent figures by the department show that every family home repossessed, that there were at least 3 others voluntarily surrendered back into the system. And this is precisely, Minister, what we are trying to achieve here in terms of the government recognising the scale of the situation. Minister Shatter at the time was concerned only with attacking Fianna Fáil. The government, he said at the time, was in power for 4 years. It would last, and it was not going to obsess on this issue, and that the responsibility for shaping society wasn't going to happen in these chambers. Minister, the government has been asleep on this. We have been witnessing a growing homeless crisis in this country, and a crisis where family homes are consistently in repossession. Both crises are interlinked. We're now on the cusp of what can be described as a societal crisis, which will have consequences for the next 30 years, and the consequences for mental ill health, homelessness, childhood deprivation, the consequences for poor education and health outcomes. Can I conclude, Minister? I'm appealing to you, those on the government benches, you as Minister, as a Minister that is acknowledged as a listening Minister, to listen to what is being proposed here tonight, and to listen to struggling families, the individuals who need your support, the individuals who elected you to this chamber, to restore some order with respect to how we can control the relationship between the debt process and the resolution process, to take away the whip from the bank's hands. Minister, you can do that tonight. You can achieve that.